Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. And I am Chris Weuve, and this is Starfleet Tactical. And I am here with somebody that I've been mentioning for the last 4 years.
And who's been dropping comments every other episode for almost that long.
And who it took forever and ever and ever to sort of orchestrate. I had to convince him to build out his basement.
We were doing that before.
He thinks that it was his and his wife's idea to finish their basement, but in reality, I was pulling the strings behind everything, getting him to finish his basement so that he would have a place where he could go downstairs and get on the stream without having to wake up his kids.
My entire family.
And so, if you haven't already figured this out, this is the one and only Andy Presby, who you've mentioned every single time I talk about how I think about Star Trek. I always say I look at a handful of canon sources. I look at the book of Okuda and Sternbach, and I run it through the thinking of Andy Presby and Pat Doyle. Pat says hi, by the way. I talked with Pat earlier today.
Oh, is he? Oh, yeah, he's got to work. Okay.
Yeah, he's currently in Phoenix, and unfortunately, with the way the time, he's flying yet tonight. And so with the way the time zones work out, I said, hey, can you be on the show? And he did the math, and he went, just about the time you guys start, I will be putting my head on the pillow to get some sleep before flying the red eye back to Minneapolis. So,
that for his job is mandatory sleep.
Yeah. So, you know what the NATOPS manual says about sleep for naval aviators?
No, I was a submariner.
Yeah, it says, yes. He says, it says that you have to get 8 hours of sleep a day, which every aviator will then tell you that means any that you get at night is extra. So here's the scoop for today. We finally got Andy on the show, and Andy started saying things like, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to do my Star Trek Power Systems talk? And I said, yes, but not tonight, because we've been talking about having Andy on the show for so very, very long that I figured that we could just sort of get questions from the audience and people making comments.
Like, who the heck are you? And why should I listen to you?
And we can have a conversation, and Andy can tell you as much as he wants to tell you about his background, and we'll sort of we'll talk about the history. I think we are going to talk a little bit about the history of Bu9, and which is how Andy and I met. When Andy and I met, I was a professor at the Naval War College, and he was a submariner working for, I believe, ComSub 4, right?
It was ComSub 4 at the time.
Yeah.
Actually, wait a minute. I might have been the executive officer of the training facility.
No. It was before you moved to the training facility, because remember, you were traveling a lot, and you actually.
That's right.
This was the previous job when you were traveling.
Yeah, he knows my career better than I do.
Yeah, well, I just remember when we met, and so it was sort of interesting in that we actually met in person on this really weird trip that I was making. I was in Norfolk to go down and teach a couple of classes for the night school for the War College, the College of Distance Education. And they try to bring in professors from Norfolk or from Newport to go down to the various places and instruct. And I had to go down to Norfolk anyway. And so I said, hey, I need to go there. I need to go to DC and anyway. I can tag on a trip to Norfolk. No big deal.
That's right.
And so that's what was going on. My friend Brian McHugh, who you've heard me mention on this show before, Brian was one of my instructors when I was in graduate school at the University of Maryland. He was then the guy whose basement I wargamed in for years and years and years and years. And then he was one of my colleagues at the Center for Naval Analysis, and he's still, a very, very good friend, et cetera. He now lives out in Albuquerque, working for CNA out there. And so, he lived in Norfolk, and I thought that Andy and he should meet. And my buddy Paul Weber, who was at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center and also wore another hat where he was at the
it was
the Navy Warfare Development Command.
Yes, NWDC.
And so he had to go down to the NWDC portion that was down there And so he was another Newport guy who just happened to be down in Norfolk. And we all got together at an Outback, which
Outback Steakhouse downtown by the river.
Yeah, and I think that Outback is now closed.
I think it has.
So it was a really eclectic conversation. The only thing we all had in common starting out was Navy stuff, although we were all science fiction fans, although it's not as apparent with the other two. So it was a really good opportunity.
Yeah, as you guys will discover if it hasn't become clear already, like Chris and I are kind of random brothers from another mother because
we're
working on our day jobs or dealing with family life stuff. Generally, we're thinking about space combat for some weird that I don't really understand myself.
And one of the funny things in all of this is that when at some point when we were comparing notes, so I've been to 2 science fiction conventions on the West Coast, LozCon in 1999 and LozCon in 2003.
2003, yeah.
So that's the only 2 science fiction conventions. In both cases, I had just gotten off an aircraft carrier, which was doing a joint task force exercise, which is their graduation exercise before they deploy. I had just gotten off the carrier. They did their exercise, and I had a couple of days to kill because it was Thanksgiving weekend. And so we get off the carrier on Tuesday, and we got a couple of days to kill, and then we start work on Monday again. And in 2003, I did not, in both cases, I did not take up CNA on the offer of a flight to where my family was for Thanksgiving. I said, I'm just going to hang out there and I'm going to go to a science fiction convention. And so in both cases, I think the second time I ended up doing Thanksgiving at Sherwood Smith's house with Sherwood and stayed at her house. And then the next day we drove from Long Beach to Burbank. And at that con, which was a lot of fun, I hung out with Sherwood, got to see things at the con. At that con, Andy was in the process of meeting the woman who is now his wife. Joelle Presby,
who is now a science fiction author, by the way,
and whose book I was prodding people about, and we want to have Joelle come on at some point too and talk about her stuff. And I claim at least partial credit because, as I tell people, I had the good sense not to meet either one of them that weekend and get in the way. So I claim at least partial credit for that.
You would have been hard pressed to this, even with our mutual interest in space combat. It would not have been apparent to me, and you would have been hard pressed to dissuade me at that point.
Well, it depends on when we met.
I guess that's true.
If we met early in the con,
then we just would have talked in a corner for 12 hours or 48 hours.
Yeah,
that is possible. That is
possible. So I claim at least partial credit for not getting in the way.
Delon says that I can have you apparently as your actual brother. He says that if I want, I can claim you. That's how I read the chat. I don't know.
And Lissa's response was, that is the most sibling thing you could say. So my ex-wife was an only child who I do not think was particularly close to her cousins. And so she would hear these stories. I've got 2 brothers and a sister. And Susan would hear these stories about us growing up. And she thought that I was part of the most dysfunctional family ever. And it was because she just didn't understand how siblings interact.
Didn't she have friends who had brothers and sisters?
She just didn't get it.
So I knew what I was getting into because very early in my life, I'm an only child too, but very, very early in my life, one of my friend's little brothers pushed me down the stairs. And I can't remember, but I think as I was tumbling down and breaking my collarbone, I'm like, oh, this is why I don't want a brother. Okay.
Yeah, that's a very... Yeah, I mean the sibling, the next step in the sibling process, and that is don't tell mom.
Yeah, no, the kid did it in front of mom, so that was pretty tough to. Yeah, that was pretty tough to hide. And
your mom or his mom?
His mom.
Yeah.
So breaking a collarbone is pretty tough to hide.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you wouldn't try.
Yeah, true.
And I was at Andy's house a couple weekends ago.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. And so it was coming back from Thanksgiving, actually, because for that trip I went to PhilCon. PhilCon was a lot of fun, and then that was the weekend before Thanksgiving, and then I went to New York for Thanksgiving, and then on my way back from New York I stopped and visited some friends, and then after that I stopped and visited more friends in the form of Andy and Joelle. And so at one point Andy and Joelle and the kids go off to church, and I got to have I don't know if I told you this, I got to have a long conversation with your mom about you growing up.
Yeah.
And she said that she's made the comment to the effect of like she watches your daughters run around being agents of chaos. And she said, Andy wasn't like that at all. Andy would just go off in the corner and color.
Or into the woods and
yeah,
trees and streams. Yeah, that was, yes. It's my daughters have surprised me too, but that's okay.
Yeah, Delon points out, I'm gonna click on it.
Oh, you have the power to make his comments highlighted.
Yes. Our other brother hit me with a boomerang. Yeah, I remember that. I remember Sean hitting him with the boomerang.
If he hits you on the way back, it was an accident.
Well, Sean, you're this thinking it was on purpose implies a degree of control that I don't think Sean had. So Sean, or what was I going to say? No, there was something I was going to say. Oh yeah, we were at one point we were talking about your daughters, and so I am an oldest child. Your mother is an oldest child. We both very much recognized Gwendolyn as an oldest child. She totally and completely profiles as an oldest child.
She does. This is well aware.
Yes.
Yeah, we are well aware.
So hello to Bob Orr, who's somebody I've known since I met Bob in grad school at a Games Workshop store.
Yeah, so what do we do? I'm trying to think, is PhilCon one of your normal haunts, or was that, I'm trying to remember.
PhilCon used to be a normal haunt.
Yeah, I think that's what you said.
So PhilCon is the con. So I said that we would tell the story of Bu9. So this is a good place to tell the story of Bu9. So Bu9 came about because of for most of Bu9 is David Weber's analytical visualization organization. That's how I describe it. It consists of some artists, and it consists of some naval experts, and it consists of some other people that have skill sets that sort of fit them into all that. In some cases, it's the superpowers being like really anal retentive about stuff, or like
having like a horrifically good memory for the Honorverse.
Yeah. So it's all sorts of stuff like that, and so the way this all worked out was for most of the people that started as part of that core group of Bu9, most of those people were fans of the Honorverse and got pulled in because they had all contacted Ad Astra Games, Ken Burnside, about the game that he was doing in the Honorverse.
Called the Saganami Island Tactical Simulator.
Yes, and it's a variation of the game that he did called
Attack Vector.
Attack Vector Tactical.
Yep.
And he and Tom Pope converted Attack Vector into being the Saganami Island Tactical Simulator. And so it was that's how most of the group got in contact, is they all contacted Ken, and at some point Ken sort of put everybody in contact with each other, and I'll talk about that in a second. I was a little bit different in that I knew Ken from SF Consummel. And so I knew
Have you ever mentioned SF-ConsML on this stream before?
I don't know if I have or not. So I've often said that if my tombstone read founder SF-ConsML, I would be perfectly happy with that. SF-ConsML is not as active as it used to be, but it's a science fiction war games mailing list that I founded back in the late 1990s. It's still going strong. So it's like 25 years old and it's still going strong. It used to be a 50 messages a day list. It's now probably a 5 messages a day list, but it's still sort of like the core. Like if you go to the Atomic Rockets website, Winchell Chung's Atomic Rockets website, and you see like randomly quoted people, those are quotes from SF-ConsML. Those are from
usually. My quotes on that site are not, but
yeah, but there's a lot of other people's that are like most.
It stands for science fiction conflict simulation. So
yes,
it's people who want.
And so it's sort of a spiritual spinoff of a list called ConSimL that was was just a straight wargaming site and a wargaming list. And the thing is, whenever anybody tried to start talking about science fiction war games, the answer was, well, science fiction, we're a historical wargaming site. There are other sites where you can talk about science fiction war games. And to which my response was, there's no general science fiction wargaming site. There's like there are BattleTech mailing lists, and there are Star Wars mailing lists, and there's Full Thrust mailing lists, but there isn't like a general science fiction war games mailing list. And so I created one, and it's still going strong. And so Ken and I knew each other from there. And so at some point, Ken gets the rights to do a game in this universe from the guy who owned the movie rights at the time. And so Ken sort of starts pulling people together, and they do Saganami Island Tactical Simulator. But he's pulling together sort of a think tank to think about these things. And next thing you know, we're all on a mailing list together. And then at some point, we end up getting together with David Weber. And so Tom met David Weber, I think about 2 hours before I did, at PhilCon in 2005, maybe? It's either 5 or 6. I think it was 5. And it might have been 6, but I'm almost positive it's 2005, like November of 2005. And that's also the con where I met Walter Hunt. Now, actually, that's the con where Walter Hunt met me. I had met Walter Hunt at a con about 2 years previously, but he does not remember that at all. And so the concept, to answer the question about what's the subject for tonight's going to be sort of a general, I should have said something more about that. That's going to be a general conversation. Sorry. Bringing Andy on board. If you got questions for Andy is...
Yeah, I was going to say, they don't know who I am.
Yeah.
What kind of questions you might want to ask me.
So Andy is a retired commander in the United States Navy.
Submarine officer who has a degree in spacecraft design from the Naval Postgraduate School. I've got degrees in physics, spacecraft design, astronautics, and of course the joint professional military education courses that you taught, right? So strategy, policy, all that stuff.
Yeah, I didn't really teach those. I was on the research side.
Yeah,
I took those classes. So the upshot of all this is that Andy's a submarine officer who speaks spaceship.
And then, to be clear, I'm a retired submarine officer. I retired from the Navy in 2018. I'm now a project manager in the aerospace industry working on advanced in-space propulsion systems to include nuclear fission propulsion systems and power systems. So power plants that go on the moon, So in Star Trek speak, I'm trying really, really hard to build the impulse drive. I'm sorry, I'm not working on the warp drive right now, but I would really like to build the matter-antimatter reactor, and I'm working really hard to build the impulse drive.
Yep. So Paul asks, attack subs or boomers? Attack subs.
Fast attacks.
Yeah. Scott Voigt asks engineering, and so he was the eng on a submarine.
Yep, I was engineer on USS San Francisco.
which a billet he took about a month.
I got the billet about 2 weeks before she ran aground. I did not get to the boat until several months after.
Oh, it was that long.
Because I was just beginning my department head school training.
Okay. So he got to spend a lot of time in a shipyard.
Ooh, somebody's been on the permit. I would love to hear those stories.
Yeah, Scott is a retired Navy chief, if I remember correctly. Scott, am I right on that, or am I? Tell me if I'm right on that. So, in any event, okay, so
Paul. So, I'm sorry.
So,
you want to take that one, or should I?
I can do it.
Go for it. My answer will be too long.
So they're usually called fast attack, although attack works too. Attack submarines are ones that have one of their primary missions is to seek out and kill things, other submarines and ships. Boomers are the ones that carry ballistic missiles, and their job is to hide with pride, because their job is to not be found so that they can maintain a nuclear deterrent. Those job descriptions sometimes are a little bit more muddled than it may sound like there. But as a general rule, the boomers are a lot bigger because they have large missile farms. They'll carry 16 or 24 ballistic missiles in them. I've never been on board a boomer. I've been on a bunch of Los Angeles class submarines, and I've been on one Virginia class submarine, and then a handful of other things too. So like I got to spend some time on an Australian submarine.
And Delon, boomer is the colloquial name. I think the proper noun name is Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine.
Yes. I remember in graduate school having to try to explain to an editor that SSBN was not an acronym. SSBN was not an abbreviation.
Yeah, no. That would be
it's a designation, it's not an abbreviation. And she kept saying, well, but that doesn't make sense. That doesn't. So what do these S's stand for? And it's not an abbreviation. No. It is an acronym, or it's not an acronym. It's like a code. It's like a serial number, sort of.
Yeah. Or like it's like a product code. Yeah. And there he is. Sweet. Good for you. And Lissa,
okay.
I see your comment. I am familiar with the Mass Effect series, but no spoilers. I haven't gotten to the game in the series that everybody hates. And I want to hate it just as much as...
Look, I haven't finished that one either. I started it. The UI is so bad. If you're neurodivergent, it is horrible to try and get through that first planet. I'm going to tell you now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
the map markers are ridiculous to try and follow.
I'm not going to involve myself in the Veilguard controversy. BioWare is not. I'm an Elder Scrolls kind of guy. I'm a Elder Scrolls CD Projekt Red kind of guy. In the very limited time now that I have to play video games, I'm a BioWare. I always bounce off their games. I don't know why.
I'm not gonna say something that's going to end with, but then I took an arrow.
But then I took an arrow in the knee. You're not?
Okay. I really want to, because I'm not really a computer game guy. I should be, but I'm not.
Oh, you totally should be.
But I literally spent probably 100 hours watching Arias play Skyrim.
Well, the time I realized I had a problem was when my mom and dad sent me to college. And my freshman year, everybody gets in trouble in freshman year, right? I am a giant geek. So the biggest trouble I really got in was Lucasfilm released X-Wing that year. And I played one day for 14 hours and didn't notice. Now, to understand that, as you can probably tell, you don't see any of my Star Wars stuff here, but flying an X-Wing, like, yeah, that was my happy place. Like, I wanted to do that since I was about 3 years old. So, yeah. Then I was like, ooh, this is a thing that could become habit forming. I should watch this
The
very
number
carefully.
of people I know in college and mostly grad school who I heard say, yeah, I got home from work and I started playing Civilization like right after I got home from work. And then I realized it was dawn.
I loved Wing Commander too. Mr. Voight's talking about the Wing Commander series. I love those. Okay, so here's the thing. Chris in his day jobs worked on threat force submarines, what Starfleet would call threat forces, what the U.S. Navy would call red forces.
I worked on blue too.
You did, well, not on submarines, right?
No, it's CNA and the Naval War College. I did blue.
Okay.
At DIA, I did red.
So I have signed very comprehensive non-disclosure agreements with the United States federal government that say, long story short, yeah, we don't discuss submarine operations. Now, that said, right, what I can say is I can obviously talk about stuff that's in the open source, right? I'll tell you, the ex-Soviet Union still puts those things on their ships, usually in the form of RBU. I can't say it in Russian, but it's a rocket-assisted depth charge thrower. Actually, I think you can see in the on the cruiser the Ukrainians sank. I think you can, in some of the photos, you can get a really good image of that. They look like clusters of tubes wrapped around an axle that can train and point and launch. And they carry them for a reason. The Russians know how to find submarines. They're not bad at it.
Although it's probably worth pointing out. Okay, so I'm willing to answer this question, having signed a whole bunch of those similar types of paperwork, but I can answer this question. The range of torpedoes has increased tremendously, and so submarines are firing from an ever increasing range. Submarines are a hell of a lot quieter than they used to be, and they're better able to stay underwater. Even the
chemically powered submarines
do not have nuclear power. Even the chemical submarine, the diesel electric submarines and their variations of that are all a lot better than they used to be. And so the threats really kind of move beyond things like hedgehogs. And so it's possible that under some circumstances you might be able to do something with a hedgehog. But that's if your primary ASW weapon is a hedgehog, you are in trouble. The ASW fight.
Yeah.
Now, depth charges. So the short answer is no. The longer answer is yes. And what I mean by that is what you think of as a depth charge, i.e., a trash can full of explosives.
That guys push off the back
of off the side of a ship. Those are gone for the exact same reason that hedgehogs are gone. Now, there are things called depth charges. As a general rule, they are either dropped from airplanes or they are launched via a missile. And the ones that the U.S. Navy deployed were part of something called ASROC. ASROC had or I'm trying to remember if SUBROC had a depth charge warhead. ASROC, I know, had a depth charge warhead or a torpedo warhead where it would throw the thing a long distance and then it would go into the water. The depth charges had a really, really big boom. A really, really big boom. So the sort of boom where you don't really need to be more accurate than put it in the water over
that way.
There. So I can't remember. I think officially all the nuclear depth charges are out of the fleet right now. I'm not sure if I remember correctly, that was the same warhead that they used on Davy Crockett, because they used that anytime they needed a small warhead, that was a good warhead to use. And if I remember correctly, they were also dial-a-yield warheads, which Davy Crockett was a dial-a-yield warhead. Dial-a-yield warheads are the coolest thing ever. They are, and Davy Crockett was, I think, the smallest implosion type device we ever made. Dial-a-yield warheads allowed you to adjust the amount of tritium that would go into it. And so it would basically, it gave you a couple of different options for how big you wanted the boom to be.
Paul's also asking if acoustic noisemakers are a thing. Torpedo decoys are a thing.
Yeah.
Torpedo decoys are a thing.
Yeah, it's a lot harder than it used to be. But the thing is that the capabilities are just a lot better across the board. And it's like everything else, it's gotten more complicated over time. Like one of the things I think I've said in the past, if I haven't said it on this show, I really should have. There's lots of cool technologies out there, right? I'm a big fan of battleships. Battleships are really seriously cool. We should not have battleships because they're not useful, but they're cool.
Something would have to change pretty.
Yeah. And I am no more happy about that answer than any of you are, right? Let me emphasize that. I am not happy that such a cool thing is not the right answer. Dirigibles fit in that same category. Blimps fit in that same category. At one point, the United States Navy used blimps to try to find submarines because you found submarines generally
on the surface.
By finding them on the surface, at least finding a periscope, and you could mount a reasonably good sized radar if you needed to in a blimp. You could certainly have guys with Mark 1 Mod 0. Well, actually Mark 1 Mod 1 eyeballs, because the Mod 1 is the fact that they were
binoculars. Oh, you're not talking about the Macon and the original airships.
No, I'm talking about the other blimps and stuff that we did.
Okay.
During the war, we had blimps that would go off and find submarines. And occasionally people will say, hey, maybe we should have dirigibles or blimps that go do this again. Yeah. And once again, dirigibles and blimps are cool. No, we shouldn't. We shouldn't do that. And the reason why we shouldn't, the one question you should always ask yourself in that situation is, could this job be better done by a helicopter? Because the answer to that question is yes.
Pretty much always.
It's almost always yes.
So in my sci-fi consulting brain, or in my space combat brain, you're going to hear Chris and I say, and Chris says it all the time on the show, and it's just as applicable for trying to predict the future of naval warfare, ground warfare, anything else. You're going to hear a lot of us say, well, it depends on your assumptions. And so, and you can see a world where if we had rail guns or coil guns and electromagnetic launchers that could throw shells 500 kilometers, and a nice nuclear reactor and all sorts of laser emplacements to burn things out of the sky as they came in, and probably we'd have to make some real serious advancements in armor. You could see a world where a battleship the size of a Nimitz might be useful, but then again, because I guarantee you those guns and those lasers would need a really big ship, just like an aircraft carrier, to carry the power plant and all the physical plant necessary to build the weapon. But yeah, not looking good.
Yeah, Paul made the comment that BBs are going to get a revival, I think, with lasers. No,
I wouldn't say. I'll never say never, but I don't know.
And the reason why I'm skeptical of this, Paul, is because, okay, so lasers give you the ability to hit out to the horizon, but you don't need a battleship for that.
True.
You don't need a battleship to hit to the horizon. The horizon isn't that far away. Battleships are potentially useful because you can mount big things on them that could hit way beyond the horizon, right? It's not unreasonable to think that if you had a rail gun with a rocket assisted round, or even without a rocket assisted round, right? If you had a rocket assisted round for a 16-inch gun, it's not unreasonable to think that you could be plunking targets 200 kilometers away. The issue with doing that is going to be your targeting. The issue is always targeting, right? And in that case,
there's one other issue. What's the range on the what are all the ranges on the current generation of coastal defense anti-ship missiles and ballistic missiles?
Oh yeah,
it's a lot bigger than 200 clicks.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to be, if you're out in the middle of the Pacific, maybe that's the case. I'm not sure that it helps you to do shore bombardment stuff. And you know, the big advantage of a gun over a missile is that a missile has higher performance across the board. Guns are cheaper and can get you volume of fire in a way that missiles can't.
Theoretically.
And so the issue that you run into, though, is that in a lot of instances, it's like, okay, if I need to hit something 300 miles away, I can use a missile on it. And I still have the targeting issue, right? We had Tomahawk anti-ship cruise missiles, TASM, Tomahawk anti-ship missile, that could go out to 400 miles. The problem is we couldn't target to 400 miles.
Though I will point out, in the modern world, we're just a heck of a lot better at seeing stuff. So
we are. The problem with Tomahawk was time late. And sort of the thing about Tomahawk was almost as bad as Harpoon. The joke about Harpoon was that when the Harpoon was dropped into the mailbox, the address was "to whom it may concern." And Tomahawk was almost as bad. And the thing is, Tomahawk out at 400 nautical miles has a long time of flight. It takes a while to get out there. And so little differences in position can make a big difference there. Oh, by the way, back to helicopters for a second, because we are doing a science fiction show, right? One of the things about helicopters are this really, really interesting analogy. Like if you look on Battlestar Galactica, the closest thing to a helicopter there is a Raptor. And think about some of the capabilities the Raptor had when it's got its full missile packs and all the rest of it. And you know, it can carry people. It can have more than one crew. It could have like 3 different crew or 4 crew able to do different things. It can carry lots of decoys, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of capability there. And so the helicopter equivalent can give you a lot of capability in a science fiction setting. Now, note though, this gets back to the old saw that I keep going back to, which is that ships are on the surface of the ocean, aircraft are in the air. There is a difference between the air and the ocean that those different platforms take advantage of. If you're out in space, you don't have that difference in the media, right? And so you might have difference in capabilities, et cetera, but you're going to have those differences in capabilities for different reasons than you have them in a terrestrial navy.
One point of order, just if your reader or if your listeners kind of Google around on the internet, you can find open source reporting and articles. The U.S. Navy did an upgrade of the Block 4 Tomahawk, I want to say in like 2017, 2018. They released a contract to reintroduce an anti-ship capability to the weapon.
Yep.
So
yep.
Read into that contract what you will about the targeting question.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I mean, it's gotten better across the board. The data links have gotten better. There's just all sorts of things across the board that have gotten better. But it was before, TASM was sort of like, TASM was the poster child for parallel development, right? Yep. And parallel development is a good thing when it works. But they started multiple projects, all of which they knew were going to take 10 years to get, I'm picking a number out of the air. 10 years is about right. Would take 10 years to get to fruition. And they said, well, here's the problems we're going to solve. You guys solve the issue of getting a missile out to that range. You guys solve this issue. You guys solve this issue. One of the issues was, how do we target the damn thing? And that's the issue they never quite pulled together.
Well, never say never. They didn't pull it together in the time frame of the Cold War.
Yes, but at that time, they never quite pulled it together. And so you also had, I'm trying to remember exactly when TASM left the fleet versus collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it was about the same time.
I'm trying to remember if there were any left in the fleet when I joined.
And they took all those TASMs. I believe they took all those TASMs and remanufactured them into land attack
missiles.
Just like when they took the submarine-launched harpoons out of the fleet, they remanufactured them into air-launched harpoons, and now they've since reintroduced submarine-launched harpoons into the fleet. And so all of these things are hard to do. And you know, this is the other thing that is important to remember, is that any capability that you maintain, you pay a price for. You pay a price to develop the capability. You pay a price to maintain the capability.
You also pay the opportunity cost of having maintained that capability and not maybe developed a new one.
Yes, you always pay opportunity costs. So you have to.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry.
Liz
has put some links in the chat, just so you know about the upgrade.
Okay. I there's a reason why I'm a producer. I was a Model UN kid, and I can do research on the fly.
Yes, that's why. So Melissa, I have a friend named Melissa. Lissa does two different things here. So if we have a problem, she can work the problem while I'm songing and dancing. That's not really that big a deal on Starfleet Tactical. It has been a big deal on the wargaming conference that I run once a year, where there have been times where it's like, yeah, we're having an issue. Somebody has to work the issue while the rest of the conference is proceeding on. The other thing is that she can go and do research in a way that it's tough for me to do research when I'm talking. There is an opportunity cost that you have to pay. You have to have a training. You pay the cost of people knowing how to use the system. You pay the cost of maintaining the system. You pay the cost of replacing the system, because these things wear out. And some of it is they just get old, right? I did an exercise one time where people pulled some stuff off the shelf that was beyond its shelf life, and it didn't work.
Shelf life is a real thing.
A lot of them didn't work. Like 68 out of 70 didn't work. And we were really pissed when we found out, because some commander viewed this as an opportunity to get rid of his expired inventory. And so we moved a whole bunch of ships and planes. We moved analysts from Virginia to Hawaii. We moved a whole bunch of people into position to conduct an exercise to assess our capability of doing something. And somebody said, we're going to use the old weapons, and they didn't work.
Nice.
Yeah, and they were beyond their, and nobody should have expected them to work because they had an expiration date. The batteries were only good for a certain period of time. And the way you solve that problem is you send them back to the factory and they get remanufactured with new batteries. So somebody had a nuke question here that I was going to...
nuke powered?
No, Davy
radiation.
My all-time favorite nuclear weapon.
Yeah, that's all you, bro.
Yep. So if you're shooting at Davy Crockett, how do you keep from dying in the process? So the joke on Davy Crockett was that at least the bigger of the smaller of the two recoilless rifle rounds, at least when you had it cranked up, the joke was it had a PK of 2. So if you know, PK of 1 means you're guaranteed to get the target. PK of 2 means you get the shooter too. Yeah. So for what it's worth, the nuclear depth bomb on Azrock, the joke was it had a PK of 2 as well. So I am told that the concept of operations for Davy Crockett was, you've got a recoilless rifle on the back of a Jeep. The Jeep is on the top of a hill. The engine is running and the Jeep is pointed in the direction where it can go down the hill. The guy fires the weapon, at which point, after the recoilless round leaves the tube, the driver guns the Jeep to get as much of the hill between you and the big, big boom as you can get.
That would seem to be a reasonable thing to do.
Now, why don't we have Davy Crockett in the Force? We talked about deploying it. We started to, and then we went, oh, no. We built it, but we never really deployed it. The idea was it was a platoon level nuclear weapon. The thought was, we're putting a tremendous amount of firepower in the hands of relatively low-level units. We can save money on personnel. It is not the case that every time somebody comes up with an idea that will, quote unquote, save money on personnel, that it ends up leading to a dramatic increase in the number of personnel needed. But frequently that is the case, and this is one of those examples, because at some point somebody said, well, here's the security procedures that we'd use for nuclear weapons. Do we want to use less security procedures for these nuclear weapons? Or are we okay with a platoon-level nuclear weapon? And the answer was, we do not wish to dial back on the security procedures for the nuclear weapons, at which point it was pointed out that, in effect, for every nuclear weapon armed platoon, you needed another platoon of guys to do security for the nuclear weapons.
Yeah. It's one of the things about Trek. Okay, so at some point, if you guys have me back on, you're going to hear me say that I've spent my entire life trying to build the Starship Enterprise. And then as I got older and more mature, the question of who the heck is Starfleet? How can this organization exist? And I'll be the first to admit that Star Trek the on-screen stuff doesn't always necessarily do a great job of answering that question, but it's very aspirational and inspirational, because Trek is aspirational and inspirational for lots of reasons. And for me, it's, hey, they're the federal government, and they appear to be pretty bright, and they appear to be pretty good at their jobs. But one of the things that always gets me, like, there's the Enterprise D's warp nacelle back there. That thing carries 250, 62 kiloton or 62 megaton nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And it looks like Picard can deploy them. I mean, there's no two people turning keys. Worf, he just says, Worf, make that go away. And the Klingon presses a red button and that thing goes away. And I'm like, whoa, right? So that's an interesting aspect that doesn't get a lot of play in a lot of science fiction. I think Andromeda talks about, like, Andromeda's got, I think Andromeda's got star killing weapons where there's really lots of, security around deployment, and they have to think very carefully before they press big red buttons. But a lot of other sci-fi doesn't do that.
Yeah, and so there was a guy named Honegger, something like that, who had started, his retirement gig was, he was writing science fiction. Unfortunately, he died during COVID. But Paul Honsinger, he had a series of books where, like, they're doing nuclear release protocols. I mean, you'd recognize these protocols, 2 keys, the whole bit, and they're running through the process. And there's a couple of instances where it's like, we need to launch like right now. And so you can tell they're running through the process as fast as you humanly can run through the process without skipping any steps. Which is sort of interesting.
There's a couple of good comments there. I agree that Starfleet was supposed to be a utopia, but Kirk tells Scotty to initiate genocide at least. Like, there's like a general order for genocide, like 2 times in the original series.
And I cannot dispute this. However,
and also they routinely use photon torpedoes to, like, solve geological problems in Next Gen.
Also not wrong. I mean, if you look at the movies, the fucking Genesis project is literally initiated by one. You are 100% correct.
And
I said close to a utopia for a reason.
I'm with you. I do like okay. So just so you guys know who I am, like the juxtaposition of those two things is why I love the show, because they put them next to each other, and then they're like, "Hey, they figured it out. Why don't you?" Right? And so that makes me happy. Somebody in there pointed out that so when you've got an antimatter powered starship, that is true. If you slam, we don't talk a lot about in Trek about what happens when you slam a ship at FTL speeds into a planet. I'm sure it's bad.
It's probably very bad, especially if you think about like matter antimatter interaction and how like what we know of it in real life at the moment and how badly that probably would go.
Michael's right. If I slammed like a galaxy class is something like 4 million tons, if I slam that into a planet, the antimatter is not going to matter at all.
Yeah, the antimatter is rounding error. Yeah,
but Michael, the difference is you don't have to take one of your shuttlecraft and slam it into the planet. You've got 253 of these, or you got 250 of these little things, and you can just sort of the photon torpedoes appear to be really handy weapons. They can kind of do anything you want them to do. So I guess what I'm pointing out is it's just every captain in Starfleet is like a ballistic missile submarine captain times.
You're not wrong.
Which is why I love the
photon torpedo happens to be Trek's answer to we don't know what we should do. Throw something at it. Fire all weapons.
Yeah, and so there's a couple. Well, we could talk about pseudo momentum. I think Sternbach and Okuda talk about the pseudo momentum. You're right, One Horse. They're not traveling at FTL technically. And there is one time I know of off the top of my head in the series where a Klingon bird of prey goes to warp in the upper atmosphere of Earth in like 1986. That's Star Trek 4. So technically, yeah, probably warp fields in an atmosphere aren't that bad. But still, they can, like the galaxy can do 0.25 C easy, right? That's full impulse. And there's no reason they can't go faster. So
it entirely depends on what the episode wants the plot to do, is what I'm going to say, because there are definitely episodes where they've gone FTL in atmosphere and it's caused horrible things to happen. But there are other episodes where it's absolutely just treated like, oh, yep, this is an everyday like occurrence. Like, yeah, it's not the greatest thing on the ship because like there's a lot of mass going through entry, but we can do it. So it's entirely dependent on how the plot needs it to work that day.
Michael, if you could get me the episode reference, I would love to know that, because Pat Doyle's always looking for those references. I don't remember that one, but it's been a long time since I've made myself watch all of Next Gen. And
I'll be back. I'm going to dig now.
And One Horse, I have in the heart of my the refit Enterprise is if I ever tell them why I do what I do and how I got on this weird life path that I got on, by the way, tell your kids don't do what Andy did. But the whole reason I'm in all the gigs I'm in is the refit Starship Enterprise. My daddy took me to see Star Trek The Motionless Picture when I was 4 years old. I thought the damn thing was real. I've been trying to build it ever since. But there's one line in that movie that as a tech geek makes me so happy, which is when Scotty says, intermix, set bridge, impulse power at your discretion, by which he means that the warp reactor is powering the impulse drive. And it's really cool. I have an entire talk on that. I'm not going to bore you with it now. Chris might not ever let me bore you with it.
No, he's gonna do it, but it's gonna be more than one episode, because the normal Andy version of it's like 2 hours.
Logic's Finest has a question, but I don't know which statement he's referring to.
I'm gonna go down through some of the stuff here. So going back a little ways, Paul says,
yes, Delan, I said The Motionless Picture because it is my favorite movie of all time, but it is an irrational love, and I can't explain why I like it, because it was written into my baseline code at a very young age. And so I just love that film.
So Paul says the Army hangs that 100-pound plus warhead off a parachute is to drop behind enemy lines. Yeah, that's the Davy Crockett warhead. Not only do they use it in the atomic demolition munition, or at least they used to, when I don't think that's in the force anymore, but you set the timer in the airplane and the parachutist has no way to change the timer. Because the idea is he's going to leave it behind. He's going to hide it wherever they need to make the big boom. And then he's going to try to get as far away from it as he can before the boom happens. And so basically you set the thing and you can't turn it off. Okay.
Well, it's on a parachute.
No, it's on the back of a parachutist. There's a guy who places it. He jumps out of an airplane carrying an atomic bomb.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess it happens in movies all the time, so sure, why not? I did not know that. That's a new one on me.
Okay.
I even love the pajama uniforms. I love everything. This is why it is not a rational love, guys. Star Trek: The Motion Picture is encoded in my little young mind.
I love the uniform we see Kirk in at the beginning, but once he goes on board the ship in the pajama uniform, I
can't say anything. I grew up on Army of Darkness, my guy.
I like that first uniform, but not the second one. Let's see. I'm looking. There was another comment. Somebody asked. I think I've gone beyond it, but somebody asked.
Logix asked a question, but I don't know what they were asking.
Well, somebody asked the question about what's a recoilless rifle. So a recoilless rifle is an attempt to have your cake and eat it too. It's it is like a missile tube. It's like a bazooka, but it's also like a gun in that it's got a shell that when you fire it, it expels like a rocket exhaust to counteract the recoil of the weapon. So a recoilless rifle has, like the recoilless rifle that they fired these things from, has an opening on the back of the tube for the exhaust gas. So the end result is you get something that is not does not shoot as with as much power as a gun, and it does not shoot with as much power as a missile, but it has a lot of the good attributes of both. And the end result is because it's recoilless, you can make it relatively light. So the only recoilless rifle I know that currently is in production is the Carl Gustav recoilless rifle anti-tank gun. And the way it works is basically the warhead does all the work. So it's a relatively, I believe it is the case that it is a relatively, as these things go, low velocity weapon, but the warhead does all the work. But it has the advantage that it's lightweight. You can carry it around. You can use it to do stuff.
Okay, a couple of points of order. I think we should probably answer Logic Finest question. So Logic, first of all, Alpha Centauri is about 4.4 light years away. That's the first part. So it's not quite as bad, but you're right. So in terms of whether FTL is viable or not, obviously we don't know. Under Einstein's general relativity is currently understood. The answer is we can write math. If you want to learn about this, you can Google the Alcubierre drive, ALQUECU, BIERRE, I think. Miguel Alcubierre. He was a graduate student when I was in college. He actually called it the warp drive. He There's no engineering in it, but it's a paper. It's the warp drive, faster than light travel within general relativity, I think is the name of the paper. It's a technical paper. It's a letter in the Physical Review from 1994 or 5, I think. And you make a gravitic pit in front of you, a flat space in the middle, and a gravitic hill behind you. And that bubble and it's a bubble, like it's a warp bubble. He's not kidding. He wasn't kidding. But that bubble theoretically can move at any speed. So that gives you either warp drives or jump drives, sort of, kind of, but it's a mess. And no one has the slightest clue how to make positive gravity. And if you look at the curvature, and I can't remember, it's been years since I've read the paper, but yeah, Phil's got it. It requires exotic matter, and the amount of energy required is insane. Like, you just converted Jupiter directly into energy. Good job. The interesting thing about that, though, is that you could think about, like, all the stuff that Star Trek says they do with the drive in the tech manual, in TNG tech manual. Rick Sternbach was an aerospace artist in California, in addition to working in Hollywood, right? So you can go back in his pedigree and you can find he's one of the 2 science people on Star Trek: The Next Generation, if you don't know. And I'm not saying he was a genius or a warp physicist or anything like that, but the guy was. If you read and I don't have my copy behind me, but if you read the acknowledgments in the TNG Tech Manual, there are some big names in my world, and I build atomic rockets for a living now. Like, my group is building one and working on a power plant. Groups I work with are building one and working on a power plant we're going to put on the moon in the hopefully next decade or so, right? And so Sternbach and Okuda were plugged into the California aerospace community, but the stuff they did, like the warp drive, it's not on all the time. It's pulsed. They cycle it. So that's a trick you do in fusion rockets, in rotating detonation rockets, and all sorts of other places in engineering to reduce the total power by increasing the peak power. So I'm not saying warp drive's real. Please, I'm not saying warp drive's real. I don't know. I'm not that smart. In fact,
it was a theoretical proof.
It was a theoretical proof. The reason I joined the Navy is because I got my physics degree from Carnegie Mellon in 1997 and discovered I'm too dumb to invent the warp drive. I literally went to get a physics degree because I wanted to invent the warp drive, discovered I was too dumb, but discovered there were these things called nuclear fusion drives that were actually in the literature. And I was like, I might be able to build one of those. Those would be cool. I'm not working on fusion drives now. But anyway, it's this kind of geekiness inside the Trek tech canon is why I love it so much, because they do all the things that make it almost believable that, sure, we could go FTL. It's easy. You just say engage.
So this is a good question. Why don't ships other than carriers have nuclear power plants? Andy, of course, as a submariner engineer,
and to close off the logics question, Phil's summary is exactly right. We have we have theoretical ways that FTL might be possible, but no reason to believe that it's realizable.
Yeah,
you have no engineering to make any of it happen at all.
Yeah. So we used to have nuclear powered cruisers. The problem with nuclear power is fantastic. For a really big ship, nuclear power gets you a whole lot. The problem you run into with smaller ships is that nuclear power plants don't scale down for shipboard use very well.
And they are very expensive.
They're very expensive. So the nuclear cruisers, you end up with something that increases your personnel costs because there's a lot of extra training involved, and those people are valuable in the outside world.
And they leave.
Increases your acquisition cost, increases your maintenance cost.
Because the quality assurance on a nuclear power plant is more demanding than the quality assurance on a conventional power plant.
And there's some very interesting things that happen in nuclear power plants. You You're taking a form of matter and converting it to another matter. That has implications.
Okay, we've gone over an hour, and
Yeah.
I think you and Lissa you guys try to keep it to an hour.
Oh, we sort of kind of.
Can I tell a kind of a funny day job story?
Sure.
Okay, so, and this is relevant.
Let me finish this part first, though.
Yeah, go ahead. But it's relevant to his question.
Yeah. And the other thing is that those plants are big enough that it actually impacts things like magazine size and stuff like that. So you end up carrying fewer weapons. Now, you might think you'd be willing to do all that because you would decrease the logistics footprint so much. In a world where you're escorting a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier or a conventional aircraft carrier, the answer is no, you're really not decreasing the logistics footprint, because the logistics footprint of a carrier battle group or a carrier strike group is 90% plus defined by the amount of aviation fuel that the air wing uses. Yeah. You're still going to have to do an underway replenishment every 4 days to keep the fuel tanks full. Now, in a world where you got rid of the airplanes and you got rid of the aircraft carrier and all you had was surface action groups with nuclear-powered battleships, maybe an all-nuclear force would make sense. That's a different mathematical calculation. You still have all the issues with it being insanely expensive and you pay a big price for it. Go, Andy.
So just with respect to the difference, to kind of the cost of adding nuclear to a system. So because obviously I worked on nuclear submarines and I worked nuclear power plants before, but the United States at least, hasn't flown a nuclear fission reactor, not fusion, but fission, a nuclear fission reactor in space since the 1960s. And so there's not a lot of lived experience in the aerospace community right now about doing that. And so I often am in the place where I know a bit about space and I know a bit about reactors, and I put them together. And I'm the guy in the room who's kind of done both, right? And so the space people, when they're working on one of these projects and trying to design the thing, they'll often come to me, or not me, but they'll come to the nuclear people and they'll be like, because space engineers love systems engineering. They treat things as discrete black boxes with very neat interfaces between the parts. It's a very efficient way to do engineering, and it's a good way to do engineering. But this nuclear black box, this is like nothing I've ever worked with before. It reaches out and touches every other system on the bird, and it's like, yeah, get to your stages of grief. You have to take a whole new textbook off the shelf to begin talking about integrating nuclear technology into your whatever. I don't care if it's a Starship or a Cuisinart. You need a whole different textbook that you just don't need to do 95% of the other engineering anybody does. But I work with space people, right? And space people know they do the hardest thing in the world, and rockets are hard, and people have seen people blowing up rockets a lot lately, and it's like, yeah, but we get this. It's like, okay, when was the last time you turned on a rocket and it transmuted the elements in the rest of your spacecraft into new elements? Oh, never? Yeah. Okay, so that's what the reactor's doing. Okay, and it's a great way to kind of break the ice between the two engineering communities. And that's the sort of thing you have to think about when you're operating a nuclear power plant on a ship or anywhere else, right? You have a whole nother layer of I'm calling them problems, but you have a whole nother layer of complexity that you have to account for getting that matter to do what you want it to do.
Now it's
half-lives, chemical reactions, everything.
Now it's probably worth pointing out that the closest environment I can think of to being near a nuclear reactor is probably being in space. In that it's a high radiation environment, and you have to take that into account with your electronics and stuff like that. True. But I mean, that's one of the things to keep in mind about every time anybody talks about nuclear powered airplanes or nuclear powered missiles or any of the rest of this stuff. Shielding is heavy. If you don't have the shielding, your power system is going to screw with your navigation system and every other system on your bird. And so that's one of the reasons why we talked about doing a nuclear powered bomber. but there's all sorts of issues with what happens when they crash and all sorts of other things. The other thing is for airplane purposes, a nuclear power gets you endurance. It doesn't get you high performance.
No, because the shielding is so heavy that it kind of messes with your thrust to weight and a lot of other characteristics you'd like for aircraft propulsion.
And that's even if you're at the point where you're doing things like, well, we'll only station it in the middle of nowhere, and all the air crew aboard will be guys who have already had all their kids, and we'll make them get vasectomies before they get assigned to the bomber force, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even if you've already done all that stuff, you still have to have enough shielding that it really screws with your thrust to weight ratio. So for airplanes, it generally ends up not working. The way we solve that problem is we put it on the aircraft carrier, and we let the aircraft carrier be the mobile air base.
Mm-hmm.
I've often said that aircraft carriers are explicitly a way of attempting to have your cake and eat it too, to get the high performance that you get out of pointy-nosed fixed-wing aircraft, while at the same time, so you can make a small airplane that's got really good performance, while at the same time having long endurance and the ability to get long distances. And you do it by building a portable air base that you move to wherever you need it.
And well, getting off nuclear aircraft, I haven't seen it. The only thing I'll say is I haven't really seen anybody seriously propose a nuclear aircraft in quite some time. Folks still I don't know, it was in the news a couple years ago. Russia seems to really like nuclear powered cruise missiles or something. That was big in the news a year or so back, 2 years back. Sure. Okay. But I do want to say, Logic's Finest asked up thread.
That thing's going to kill more Russians than it will Americans.
I'm not going to speculate on that, but it is not a thing I would be eager to work on. Let me put it that way. Logic's Finest asked a couple of up thread. Space 1999, gotta love it.
We'll come back to that.
How close we are to fusion propulsion, and there's been a discussion in the thread about whether or not chemical propulsion isn't going to give us interstellar travel, and I think that's very true. Some form of nuclear propulsion. The kind of nuclear propulsion I'm working on is nuclear fission propulsion. It might get you probes to kind of quasi-interstellar things in a human lifetime, like objects in the Oort cloud out where Pluto hangs. But yeah, if you're talking about human interstellar transport with a rocket, you have to talk to one of my idols, Dr. Robert Bassard. Logic asked, how close are we to nuclear fusion propulsion? I'd say we have papers on it. We at least understand the basic physics. It doesn't look like it would be impossible to build. Of course, there's a lot of engineering problems between here and there. In my own personal opinion, it's possible that we'll have nuclear fusion space propulsion systems before we have economically viable terrestrial nuclear fusion reactors. But I haven't really studied the crop of new fusion companies that are trying to do that now today, build small modular reactors, nuclear fusion on the ground. Part of the reason I got into this gig was reading about early ideas about nuclear fusion pulse propulsion. Project Daedalus, if you ever want to Google that, it's for my money the most detailed real starship design ever made. It was made by the British Interplanetary Society in the late 1970s. If you look at the spaceflight chronology, one of the early Star Trek technical books, upon which a young Rick Sternbach did illustrations, you can see the influence of the Daedalus, I think, designs in some of the early Star or Federation terrestrial or Earth ships. But when I had the pleasure of, the Bassard ram scoops on the front end of all Federation starship, warp nacelles, are named after a real guy. named Dr. Robert Bussard. He was one of the first nuclear engineers in the United States. He was in his 80s when I met him, still tall and really hale. And he got so frustrated reading papers about how interstellar travel was impossible that he sat down and thought about it some and decided, well, what if you could, he took what we knew about the interstellar medium and he said, well, what if we have nuclear fusion? Can we build a big magnetic scoop in front of the ship that sucks in interstellar hydrogen and burns it in a fusion reactor, and could we get to the stars that way? The answer is, whoa, that's hard. But theoretically, you could do it with a rocket.
Yeah.
If you could crack nuclear fusion, and if you could burn hydrogen, which is really hard, and if you could make a magnetic scoop about 1,000 kilometers wide, which is also really hard, and sad face, if the interstellar medium around the Earth was actually, around the solar system, was actually as dense as Bussard thought at the time, and it's not. So we don't live in a good neighborhood for ramjets, for Bussard ram scoops, but that's another place where real science shows up in Trek.
And the other issue is that I think some of the calculations show that you'd actually that scoop is going to create more drag than you're going to be able to compensate for.
Yeah, that was always one of my worries about.
So it's actually an excellent way to slow down when you get to your target, but it's not necessarily a way to speed up. So let's go ahead and pop this nuclear waste on the moon thing. So the only reason I want to put this up is that when I was in graduate school, there was an extra credit question on one of the week's homework that said, if you took all the nuclear weapons on Earth, put them in a single location on the moon, and detonated them all at the same time, what happens?
Nothing.
The answer is you get a light pulse that lasts 30 seconds.
Oh, that's longer than I'd expect.
And the amount of movement of the moon is lost in the significant figures.
And yes, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
Oh, I would be remiss, though, if, as a guy who works in this professionally, I didn't say we built and tested it in the Nevada desert in the 1960s, 20-some nuclear thermal rockets. So, yeah. And the Russian, at the time, the Soviet Union tested more. None were ever flown because, if memory serves, they were really a backstop to hydrogen-oxygen combustion used in the upper stage on Saturn. If we couldn't crack burning hydrogen and oxygen, we were going to use a nuclear thermal rocket to just blow hot hydrogen out the back to get them to the moon. That
may have been where it started, but it
kept going.
Yeah, I mean, NERVA was always envisioned as sort of a post-Saturn thing. So Saturn is an interesting thing.
Saturn V, by the way, just the Saturn V rocket, not the planet. But so anyway, just to finish the thought, Chris, we have built, other people have built fission propulsion systems. So those we're fairly confident we can build, and they'll do. I mean, they will substantially improve our propulsion capability for spacecraft.
Yeah. Saturn was an interesting program. We made an explicit decision, NASA made an explicit decision to go with a technology that was designed to get us to the moon, as opposed to a technology that was designed to be easily usable to do other things also. And because we had a time limit, and you could make a pretty good argument that they made the right answer in that our window closed on December 31st of 1969, and we landed on the moon on July 20th of 1969. So we didn't have a whole lot of margin, as it turns out, to successfully land on the moon. And so going with the moon landing specific hardware was probably a good idea. There was a follow-on effort that got zero funded called the Saturn Applications Program. And so it was about all the different things you could do with Saturn hardware, one of which was, at one point they were talking about doing a manned flyby of Venus. they were going to stick a couple of astronauts in an Apollo capsule for like 4 months.
For the short trip.
Oh my God. That didn't happen, obviously.
And yes, One Horse, I am working on the DY 100.
Yeah.
I often think
a lot of craziness there. But NERVA was a follow-on program, but I mean, basically everybody treated it like we checked the box. Why do we need to do manned space anymore? So that's part of it. The other thing is everybody sort of said, okay, they shifted to the shuttle as a way to sort of develop space. The shuttle was very much of a compromise. That's my complaint with For All Mankind, is that in a world where the budget is unlimited, go, because we're in full competition with the Russians, we do not build the space shuttle that we built. We just don't. Because that was the space shuttle that was designed as, after they cut the budget the first time and the second time and the third time. And then they also said, you've got a maximum amount you can spend and a maximum amount that you can spend in any given year. So the constraints on the shuttle program were not the sort of constraints that you have under we're in a competition with the Russians, go. Okay, so I'm scrolling down because at some point we should think about ending this relatively soon, but I want to make sure that we don't leave.
Some of your guests want to sleep.
Yeah, well, and I seem to recall you have to go visit your daughters at some point yet tonight.
Well, I have to go to sleep and wake up. Yeah, so logic, one of the ways to do nuclear fusion is to compress a fuel pellet with a particle beam or a laser. I mean, photons, particles, whatever. That's called inertial confinement fusion.
So there's a little bit of a discussion taking place between people about manned versus unmanned aircraft and whether aircraft have a role to play, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing I will say in all of that is surprisingly small differences in your ability to do long-range networking can have big effects. The amount, if you read anything from the Mitchell's Institute, their conclusion is that latency measured in terms of relatively small numbers of milliseconds is enough to mean that you can't do remote control. So you have to have actually AI in the cockpit, whatever the cockpit looks like. And I'm not sure we're there yet. I'm just not sure we're there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an Airedale. I worked on aircraft carriers and I work with Airedales, but
yeah. And one thing I will point out, and I've pointed this out occasionally professionally, is one of the things about the Mitchell Institute is they make this assumption that unmanned aircraft are going to mean that you have fewer pilots being put at risk. And I always point out that's not a conclusion, that is an assumption. It's not necessarily a bad assumption, but I will also point out that in 2000, if you would have asked about these new Predators that they were going to start deploying, one of the things that people always said about unmanned aircraft is it means we're going to save on personnel because they don't have pilots, and so there'll be fewer people assigned to these unmanned aircraft squadrons, and we'll realize a savings in personnel. We did not realize a savings in personnel on a per platform basis. Predators and Reapers and things like that have huge personnel costs on a per platform basis. And that's because when you take the cockpit out of the aircraft and you put it in a room, your cockpit is now room sized and you can fit a lot more people in that room. And so if you're going to run a Predator or a Reaper on a mission that lasts 10 hours, because it's long endurance, so it could last 10 hours. You probably have a relief pilot. You probably have one or two sensor people, 2 shifts of sensor people there, and there's 1 or 2 people per shift, and you've got analysts, et cetera, et cetera. You've got a huge number of people that are making that aircraft work. And there's no reason to think that, likewise with the thing about fewer pilots being put at risk, I just am unwilling to press the I believe button until somebody can give me a study that actually gives me a conclusion within a methodology, as opposed to, well, of course it would be that way, because it hasn't been that way in the past.
The other thing I'll point out, again, not an Airedale, so listen to a professional aviator, a military aviator, but the one thing I will point out is that, if you Google, what is it, we're on 5th generation fighters? Do I have the generations right? If you Google all the big defense complexes around the world, if you Google what they're working on, what the next big thing is, it's a crewed aircraft with a fleet of drones in support. And I don't know this for a fact, but I think part of the reason is, in a modern battlefield where there's lots and lots of jamming all over the place, you can't guarantee the latencies between drones and controllers that Chris mentioned. So it's probably good to have a few organic brains with eyeballs and fingers along for the ride. And they stay back a little bit, but they're harder to jam, so that if one of the drones gets knocked cockeyed by the jamming environment or runs into a situation it can't quite figure out, then it just phones home to mama, but mama's 50 kilometers back, not 1,000 miles back or 1,500 kilometers back. So it does seem like there's a lot going there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I am double checking something real quick here about EMPs, because I'm trying to remember.
2 kinds of EMP. So so there's a couple kinds of EMP. The kind of EMP that we normally think of is an electromagnetic pulse that propagates through the atmosphere. The kind somebody in the chat.
I'm not sure that you need an atmosphere, though.
Well, kind of yes, kind of no. When you hit, nuclear weapons effects are complicated, but there are different ways of. There's different ways for the blue ion glow. The ion cannons in Star Wars. Yeah. There's different ways to make the blue ion cannon glow happen, and nuclear bombs can do several of them.
Yeah. So there's the canonical book on nuclear weapons effects at the unclassified level is Glasstone, and the effects of nuclear weapons. And basically every time through 1977, I think it was, every time they did another test series of nuclear weapons, they came out with a new version of Glasstone. And Glasstone did not really get much longer over the years. And so what they would do is they would just, because they knew that anybody who was really in the field had the old editions too, they would just remove chapters and put new chapters in. And so I actually, my friend Brian McHugh started me on this kick. He does this too. But I collect different editions of Glasstone. Because there's an early edition of Glasstone that has an entire chapter on underwater effects with illustrations about they suspended a submarine in the water column and they detonated a nuclear weapon underneath it, and they did all sorts of stuff like that. And that chapter
you can find that video. You used to be able to find video from inside that hull online.
Yeah.
It's as a submariner, it's scary.
Yeah.
The one good thing about it is that if you ever got hit by an atomic weapon, you'd be standing there minding your own business, and then there'd be a big wall of white, and then you'd be dead.
Yeah, or it would be faster. So there's a whole bunch of things that can kill you on a submarine.
Yes, that is true.
So
we're at an hour and a half.
I was just thinking that that's probably a good place to stop.
probably should let people go home. And
So
go to
Andy,
sleep.
don't run away. We'll do a post-mortem after everybody else is gone.
Easy day.
But so thank you very much for finally coming on the show. I know that you've wanted to for a long time, but it took a lot of effort to make all this happen.
I feel like I know all of you.
Well, yeah, because Andy listens to the show, or watches the show all the time, so he's heard them all, and so it's good to see everybody. And once again, I am always totally amazed at the fact that everybody is willing to come and spend time listening to me on a Saturday night. There will be a show next week. The plan is for it to be Chris Carlson. And we'll talk about the Deck Combatants. So think of battle riders deployed from amphibs is probably the way to think about that. And I'm sort of thinking about what it's going to look like in the new year. I'm expecting that in the new year, we'll probably move the show to 9:00 Eastern, except with the possibility that if a guest needs to go earlier or later, like for instance, if a guest needed to put his kids to bed before he could go down into his basement and come back on the show, we would do a 10:00 show to facilitate that. And so that being the case, that's kind of what we're thinking. Bob makes the comment he'd be interested in talking to Andy at a con that he thinks.
I do those. My wife Joelle does them too. She's a science fiction writer. Chris has mentioned her book, The Dabre Snake Launcher, a couple of times on the show, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention. I think she's got a short story coming out soon in anthology called Dancing with Destruction.
Well, and then one of the things that I want to do is get her on the show too at some point.
Yeah, she would. So she was in the Navy too. She's a mathematician. She has other interesting.
Andy was a submariner. They met at the Naval Postgraduate School. She was getting a degree in anti-submarine warfare.
Yeah, which is a joke that translates really well into several Far Eastern dialects. So the Pacific Rim.
So
her captain would always drag her out in front of tour groups and say, "Yeah, she's my anti-submarine warfare officer. Her husband's a submariner," and everybody would laugh.
So for what it's worth, Bob asked what cons Andy goes to.
I don't know. Well, I know Liberty.
Years.
Well, the thing is, because we got small children, and my job responsibilities have been kind of growing monotonically, at least for a couple of years now. And so, like, we tend to go to LibertyCon every year in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That's the one where we can reliably be found. Because Bain, Joelle's publisher, has a big presence there, and so it's actually a great business meeting. It's a great con though. A lot of people like it because they cap attendance to keep the attendee to pro ratio such that you can actually talk to the people you want to meet there, which is nice. Mm-hmm. And I went to Dragon Con this year. I was actually working Dragon Con for my employer. My employer had a presence at Dragon Con this year. So that happened. That might happen again next year. Dragon Con's like the largest science fiction convention in America or the world or something. So it's kind of Atlanta goes in.
Largest fan-run convention in the United States, and it is my home convention. So
yeah, and so Atlanta just goes insane for 5 days. So it's really cool.
And so this
but other
year,
than that, I'm sorry, I don't.
What does your wife write her books under so I can drop links?
Oh, Joelle Presby. Her married name, Joelle.
So, what was I going to say? Oh, the last couple of years, we've tried to have sort of a meetup.
Mechanical 2 logic. Sorry.
We've tried to have a sort of a meetup at MarCon. MarCon isn't happening this year. We're going to try to do it at Cleveland Concoction in March, first weekend in March. We'll see if that ends up happening. The con is kind of disorganized, which is a nice way of putting it. So that actually reminds me, I need to send that information to Walter Hunt because Walter's talking about coming.
Oh, cool. Good.
So if anybody wants to show up, I'll hand you a key to the I'm getting a little parlor suite, so it's basically an extra room just for people to hang out in. And so
Yeah, we'll hang out. We'll talk.
So
Let's see. For hours.
Yeah.
As you can tell.
Yes. So, all right. Any last words, Andy?
I hope not. I hope to return. I hope the words are not my last words.
Last words for this evening, not permanently.
I'm good.
So with that in mind, everybody, thank you very much. And see you next week.
Later, y'all.